At her mother's deathbed, while grief still clung to her skin, her husband locked her out of a 100M condo and left her to marry his mistress, unaware who truly owns it and unaware that what she did next would shock him. She was the wife he mocked, the woman he called fat and disposable, standing in a hospital hallway with unanswered calls and a dead mother's last breath still ringing in her ears. But behind her quiet tears was a legal truth he never bothered to learn, and a patience sharpened by years of humiliation. As he changed the locks, paraded his mistress through glass walls, and celebrated his new life in what he thought was his 100M condo, she disappeared from his world, silent, watching, remembering every insult, every betrayal, every signature he never read. So when a grieving wife becomes the unseen owner, when a locked-out woman becomes the final authority, and when a man who thought he'd won everything realizes he owns nothing at all, who really controls the condo? What did her mother leave behind? And how far will a woman pushed aside at a deathbed go to take brutal revenge? The monitor flatlined with a sound that cut straight through Evelyn Carter's chest, a long, merciless tone that erased the last fragile hope she'd been clinging to. Her mother's hand, once warm and strong enough to braid her hair before school, went slack in her own. The room smelled of antiseptic and grief, and Evelyn couldn't tell which one was making her dizzy. She whispered "Mom" again and again, as if saying it enough times could reverse death itself. Outside the glass wall, nurses moved on, efficient and detached, while Evelyn stayed frozen, her whole world collapsing in a single breath. Her phone buzzed in her pocket once, twice. She didn't look at it. She already knew who it was. Marcus Hale, her husband of 11 years, the man who hadn't visited the hospital once, the man who'd complained just days earlier that she was letting herself go and embarrassing him in public, the same man who had promised to pick her up that evening and bring clean clothes. When she finally pulled the phone out, there was no message of condolence, no missed calls of concern. Just a short, cold notification from the building app tied to their 100M condo. Access revoked. Her breath caught. Confusion hit first, then panic. She refreshed the screen, thinking it had to be a mistake, some technical glitch at the worst possible moment, but the red text stayed. Locked out. Her fingers shook as she called Marcus. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. A third time. Still nothing. Then a message came through, not from him, but from an unfamiliar number. "He's busy. Don't disturb us tonight." Attached was a photo. Marcus, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled at her in years, his arm wrapped around a younger woman in a silk dress, the city lights of the condo glowing behind them like a trophy. Evelyn slid down into the chair, beside her mother's bed, the weight of it all crushing her lungs. At her mother's deathbed, her husband had locked her out of a 100M condo and left her to marry his mistress. The cruelty of the timing felt deliberate, surgical. He hadn't just chosen another woman. He had chosen this exact moment when Evelyn was weakest, most broken, to finish her off. A memory flashed uninvited into her mind. Years ago, when she'd first met Marcus, she'd been slimmer, brighter, still laughing easily. He had loved her ambition then, loved telling people his wife was smart. But as his career soared and his ego swelled, that love curdled. The comments started quietly. Jokes about her weight, complaints about her clothes, reminders that she should be grateful he provided. By the time the insults turned public, she had already learned to swallow her pain and smile. But her mother had seen everything. "You don't know your worth yet," her mother had told her during one of their long phone calls, voice firm even through illness. "But one day he will." Evelyn wiped her tears and stood slowly. She signed the hospital forms with a hand that no longer shook, not because she wasn't broken, but because something inside her had gone frighteningly still. When she walked out of the hospital, the night air felt sharp against her skin. She ordered a rideshare, giving the condo address out of habit before stopping herself. There was no point going there now. The locks had been changed. Marcus had made sure of that. Instead, she went to her mother's quiet townhouse, the place she hadn't stayed in years. As she lay on the old couch that night, staring at the ceiling, her phone finally buzzed again. This time, it was Marcus. "We're done. I've moved on. Don't make this difficult." No apology, no mention of her mother's death. Just finality wrapped in arrogance. He thought the 100mm condo was his leverage. He thought money and locks and public humiliation were enough to erase her. He had no idea that months earlier, while her mother was still lucid, Evelyn had sat beside this same couch and listened carefully as her mother explained things she'd never talked about before. Documents, trusts, ownership structures, and why everything had been done quietly. Evelyn closed her eyes, the echo of her mother's voice mixing with Marcus's cruelty. For the first time since the hospital, her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something colder. Marcus believed he had won. He believed he had taken everything. But as Evelyn stared into the dark, she knew one undeniable truth. The condo, the one he was celebrating in with his mistress, the one he'd locked her out of at her mother's deathbed, was never really his. And soon he would learn exactly who owned it. Evelyn did not cry the next morning. The tears had burned out sometime before dawn, replaced by a calm so unfamiliar it frightened her more than grief ever had. She showered in her mother's bathroom, surrounded by lavender-scented soap and framed photos of a life that had always been steadier than her own. When she dressed, she chose simple clothes, dark jeans, a soft sweater, not because she wanted to hide, but because she was done trying to prove anything with her appearance. The mirror reflected a woman Marcus had dismissed as fat and finished, but her eyes held something sharper now. Focus. The lawyer's card sat on the kitchen table, where her mother had left it months ago. Evelyn remembered that day clearly, the rain tapping the windows, her mother insisting she sit down. "If anything happens to me," her mother had said, "you don't argue, you don't beg, you don't explain, you listen, and then you act." At the time, Evelyn had brushed it off, uncomfortable with the finality in her mother's voice. Now she picked up the card with steady fingers. By noon, Marcus was basking in the glow of his new life. The condo buzzed with congratulatory messages from friends who had already rewritten the story. How Evelyn had let herself go, how Marcus had outgrown the marriage, how the mistress, Lauren Pierce, was a better fit. Lauren lounged barefoot on the marble floor, sipping champagne like she owned the place. Marcus loved that about her. She made him feel admired again. "What about Evelyn?" Lauren asked casually, scrolling through her phone. Marcus snorted. "She'll figure it out. She always does." He said it with the confidence of a man who had never read the fine print of anything handed to him. The condo, the one he boasted about in boardrooms and charity galas, had been framed as a gift early in their marriage, a generous gesture from Evelyn's mother to help them start strong. Marcus had accepted it without question, without curiosity. Ownership to him was possession, and possession was whatever sat under his name in public. Across town, Evelyn sat in a quiet office as an older woman slid a thick folder across the desk. No dramatics, no raised voices, just facts. "The condo is held in a family trust," the lawyer said calmly. "Your mother established it before your marriage. You are the sole beneficiary. Your husband has no legal claim. None." Evelyn inhaled slowly, absorbing the words not with triumph, but with clarity. Everything clicked. The secrecy, the insistence on separate documents, the way her mother had always smiled faintly whenever Marcus bragged about his property. "What do I do now?" Evelyn asked. The lawyer studied her for a moment. "You wait, and when the timing is right, you enforce." Waiting was something Evelyn had spent years perfecting. She did not confront Marcus. She did not text Lauren. She returned to the townhouse, sorted through her mother's papers, and found more than just legal documents. There were journals, pages filled with observations about Marcus, about how his charm sharpened into entitlement, about how love without respect always decayed. Reading them hurt, but it also strengthened her. Her mother had known. She had prepared. 3 days later, Marcus received an email while lounging beside the condo's infinity pool. It was brief, professional, unemotional, notice of ownership review. He laughed at first. Spam, he muttered, deleting it. But the next morning, the building concierge refused to accept his signature for a scheduled renovation. Ownership verification is pending, the man explained politely. Marcus felt irritation flicker, nothing more. He made a call, left a voicemail, told himself it would be handled. By evening, the irritation had turned to unease. Lauren noticed it immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Marcus snapped, though his phone hadn't stopped buzzing with missed calls from legal assistants and building management. Something was shifting beneath his feet, and for the first time in years, he didn't control the narrative. Evelyn watched quietly as everything unfolded, not from afar, but from within the system her mother had built. Each step was deliberate, each silence intentional. She imagined Marcus pacing the condo, confused, irritated, certain someone else was at fault. She imagined Lauren's smile tightening, her confidence wavering. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, it was structural. On the 5th day, Marcus finally showed up at the townhouse, unannounced, pounding on the door like he still belonged there. Evelyn opened it slowly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "We need to talk," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's been some kind of mistake." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, calm and unreadable. "Is there?" For the first time, Marcus felt it, a crack in the certainty that had carried him for years. He had locked her out at her mother's deathbed, humiliated her, discarded her like excess weight. And now, standing in that doorway, he realized he might not be standing on solid ground at all. Marcus did not sleep that night. The condo, once a symbol of his triumph, felt different, too quiet, too exposed. The city lights outside the glass walls no longer thrilled him. They watched him. Lauren noticed his restlessness, the way he kept checking his phone, the way his jaw tightened whenever another email from building management arrived. "They're exaggerating," he said for the 3rd time. "It's just paperwork." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He replayed his years with Evelyn in his mind, searching for missed signs. She had always handled the documents, always deferred when money was discussed, always said her mother preferred things structured. He'd loved that. It meant less work for him, less thinking. Across the city, Evelyn sat with the lawyer again, signing nothing, approving nothing, just listening. The power was in restraint. The trust documents were airtight. Her mother had anticipated exactly this kind of man, exactly this kind of betrayal. "You can proceed with eviction," the lawyer said. "Legally, today." Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet." She thought back to nights when Marcus had refused to come home, to dinners eaten alone, to the way he'd looked at her with irritation when she asked for affection. She remembered the day he'd called her fat in front of his colleagues, laughing as if it were harmless honesty. The humiliation had carved something deep into her. "No," she repeated. "Let him feel it first." Marcus's unease turned to panic 2 days later, when the bank froze the condo's operating account. Maintenance stopped. Services were temporarily unavailable. When he called to demand answers, the responses were polite but firm. Ownership review, beneficiary confirmation, legal compliance. Lauren stopped pretending not to notice. "You said this place was yours," she said sharply, arms crossed. "Why is everyone acting like it isn't?" "It is mine," Marcus snapped, then faltered. "It's just complicated." Her eyes narrowed. Attraction, Evelyn knew, thrived on certainty, and Marcus's certainty was dissolving fast. That afternoon he received the final notice. Vacate within 72 hours. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a verdict. He drove straight to the townhouse again, this time without arrogance, without performance. Evelyn opened the door and saw the fear he was trying to hide. It didn't soften her. "You can't do this," he said quietly. "That condo is my home." Evelyn met his gaze. "It was my mother's," she replied, "and now it's mine." The words hit him harder than any shout could have. The truth rushed in all at once. The signatures he'd never questioned, the trust he'd mocked, the woman he'd underestimated. He opened his mouth to argue, to threaten, to charm his way out, like he always had. But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. Lauren left that night, suitcase rolling across marble floors, heels clicking with impatience and disappointment. She didn't look back. Marcus watched her go, the silence of the condo swallowing what was left of his pride. When the movers arrived 2 days later, Marcus stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by boxes and the echoes of his own mistakes. The locks beeped one final time as access was officially transferred. His phone buzzed with a single message from Evelyn. "You locked me out at my mother's deathbed. Consider this the return." He sank onto the floor, the weight of it all crushing him at last. The 100M condo, the mistress, the illusion of control, gone. Evelyn, meanwhile, stood in her mother's old garden, watching the sun dip below the trees. The revenge had been brutal, yes, but it had been clean, precise, and deserved. She didn't feel joy. She felt free. Marcus showed up one last time a week later, thinner, quieter, dressed in a way that tried, and failed, to look humble. The townhouse doorbell rang softly, nothing like the pounding arrogance of before. Evelyn let it ring twice before opening the door. When she did, he didn't step forward. He just stood there, eyes lowered, hands empty. "I lost everything," he said, voice raw. "Lauren's gone. My friends, they don't return my calls. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you owned the condo." Evelyn studied him carefully. This was the man who had locked her out of a 100M condo at her mother's deathbed, who had called her fat as if it erased her worth, who had replaced her without a pause. Now he stood in front of her, stripped of status, of certainty, of power. "You didn't know," she said calmly, "because you never cared to know." He flinched. Memories flooded her. Him laughing with Lauren under the condo's lights, the access denial on her phone, the way she'd sat beside her mother's body feeling smaller than she ever had. For years she had believed endurance was strength. Now she understood that boundaries were. Marcus swallowed hard. "I made a mistake." Evelyn nodded once. "You made a choice." The distinction mattered. He tried to step closer. She didn't move, but something in her eyes stopped him anyway. "Please," he whispered, "I'll do anything." Anything. The word echoed hollowly. He had never meant it when it counted. "I'm not taking you back," Evelyn said, "and I'm not punishing you anymore." Confusion crossed his face. "Then why did you do all this?" Evelyn looked past him, out at the street where her mother used to sit in the evenings, sipping tea and watching the world go by. "Because you needed to learn that love without respect turns into entitlement," she said quietly, "and entitlement always collapses." She closed the door gently, not as an act of cruelty, but of finality. Months later, the condo stood newly renovated, not as a monument to revenge, but as a reclaiming. Evelyn didn't move in right away. She leased it, invested the returns, and poured herself into the parts of life she'd neglected while shrinking herself for someone else. She worked with a therapist. She walked every morning. She wore clothes that felt good, not clothes meant to apologize for her body. Her weight changed slowly, but her confidence changed overnight. Marcus faded into the background of her life, a cautionary memory rather than an open wound. He found work again eventually, smaller, quieter, far from the spotlight he once chased. Sometimes he drove past the condo, staring up at the glass, knowing he would never belong there again. On the anniversary of her mother's death, Evelyn stood on the balcony at sunset, city glowing beneath her. She placed a single white flower on the rail and closed her eyes. "You were right," she whispered. The wind carried her words away, and with them, the last remnants of the woman who had once begged to be chosen. She had been locked out once, at the cruelest moment of her life, but she had unlocked something far greater in herself. And that was the revenge no one could ever take from her. Years later, people who met Evelyn Carter never guessed the kind of woman she used to be. They saw confidence before they saw softness. They heard certainty before they noticed kindness. What they didn't see were the quiet foundations beneath her strength, the grief, the betrayal, the locked door that had once marked the lowest point of her life. The 100M Condo no longer symbolized loss or revenge. It became an anchor. Evelyn turned it into an asset that funded scholarships in her mother's name, helped women rebuilding their lives after divorce, and supported legal clinics that taught people, especially wives, how to protect themselves before love turned dangerous. Each check she signed felt like closing another invisible wound. Marcus never fully recovered his former shine. He learned humility the hard way, moving through life more cautiously, less loudly. Sometimes he told people he had once almost lost everything, never admitting he had already lost the most important thing long before the condo, the woman who had loved him when he had nothing. Regret followed him like a shadow, quiet but permanent. Lauren's chapter ended as abruptly as it began. Beauty without loyalty proved expensive. She moved on quickly, just as she had moved in, leaving behind a lesson Marcus would never forget. On the anniversary of her mother's passing, Evelyn returned to the hospital garden alone. She sat where she once cried and smiled softly at the memory of the woman who had protected her in silence. The inheritance had never just been money or property. It was foresight, wisdom, and a final act of love. Evelyn placed her hand over her heart and breathed deeply. She had been locked out at her mother's deathbed, humiliated, discarded, and underestimated, but she walked away with her dignity intact and her future secured. And in the end, the most shocking truth of all wasn't what she did to him, it was what she finally did for herself. Long after the legal battles ended and the whispers faded, Evelyn learned something unexpected. Peace is louder than revenge when you finally hear it. The world stopped asking her about Marcus, about the condo, about the scandal, because she stopped carrying the story like a wound. It became history, not identity. She began hosting quiet dinners in the condo once a month. Women only. Some came freshly divorced, others still deciding whether to stay or leave. Evelyn never told them what to do. She simply listened. And when she spoke, it was never about betrayal first. It was about preparation, self-respect, and the power of knowing what your name is attached to. The woman Marcus once called fat became the woman. People sought for clarity. Marcus, on the other hand, learned that humiliation doesn't always come from public exposure. Sometimes it comes from being forgotten. He sent one last message on a holiday evening, a long apology filled with regret and nostalgia. Evelyn read it, exhaled, and deleted it without replying. Closure didn't require conversation anymore. On a quiet morning, Evelyn visited her mother's grave with fresh flowers and a folded copy of the trust documents, now yellowed at the edges. She didn't cry. She smiled softly. "You didn't just leave me property," she whispered. "You left me protected." As she walked away, the sun warm on her skin, Evelyn understood the final truth of her journey. The most brutal revenge wasn't taking back the 100M condo. It wasn't watching him beg. It wasn't winning. It was becoming a woman no one could ever lock out again, of love, of dignity, or of her own life.